Okay.
I'll turn off my camera and...
Okay, welcome, and thank you for joining the webinar on bias and resistances, exploring challenges to gender equality in leadership and decision making. This webinar is co-organized by the Gearing Roles project in the framework of the Work Package 5, Leadership, and GE Academy. Gearing Roles is a strong multidisciplinary consortium of 10 European academic and non-academic partners that will design, implement, and evaluate 6 gender equality plans following the steps described in the GEAR tool, with the firm objective of challenging and transforming gender roles and identities linked to professional careers and work towards real institutional change. Through the Gearing Roles project, coordinated by University of Deusto, 6 new gender equality plans will be implemented in 6 European institutions. Our focus is on the deconstruction of sexual roles in order to unveil often unconscious gender biases that operate in processes of decision-making, selection and promotion of people, and in the attribution of value and recognition. We follow the steps set by the GEAR tool. First, understand the context, evaluate the state of play in the institution, plan and set up the GIP, act and implement the GIPs, and monitor progress and evaluate the effectiveness of the GIPs. Our 4 main objectives are to remove barriers to female recruitment and devise personal career development plan, to provide alternative references in traditionally male-dominated areas and in those where women are majority but kept under glass ceilings, to disseminate the common framework and output for institutional gender assessment, planning, monitoring, and evaluating to establish commitment to gender equality in major European stakeholders, organizations, and build a scientific production in relation to gender and feminist studies. And finally, to address gender imbalances in the representation processes and the promotion of women leadership in research institutions. For that purpose, we are developing different resources. You can find them in our web, and also a set of webinars where this first one is framed. I'm sure that we are going to enjoy it and we are going to learn a lot together. And thank you very much again for your participation.
Thank you very much, Maria, for this presentation. I will share my screen. My name is Vasia Matesi, and welcome also from my side on this webinar. I'm representing the Gender Equality Academy project, and as Maria mentioned, this is a collaborative effort. We are trying to join forces for offering these webinars in the time of this pandemic. So I would like to start with sharing a few words about the Gender Equality Academy project. So I will start with the challenge that we are trying to tackle. So currently there are many gender equality programs, projects, and great knowledge and experience in gender equality and such topics. But there is a rather small proportion of researchers and practitioners that are familiar with theoretical and methodological concepts of gender and feminist scholarship. So in this respect, the Gender Equality Academy project, as an Horizon 2020 project funded by the Research and Innovation Program, develops and implements a high-quality capacity building program on gender equality in research, innovation, and higher education. In the realms of this project, we are offering a series of training sessions in different formats and in different topics. Due to the pandemic, we are now unable to offer any face-to-face sessions, but we hope that those will be up very soon. At the moment, we are preparing our open collaborative course that will be available on June for everyone to get connected with us and attend the course. And of course, we are offering interactive webinars. You can find more information at our website. We are a consortium of 12 organizations all around Europe. I represent the Labs and Innovation Pole in Greece and Cyprus, and I'm taking this webinar from my home office in Thessaloniki. I would like to let you know that we also have a YouTube channel, which is called Gender Equality Academy EU, where this webinar and all the other webinars of Gender Equality Academy are uploaded, and this one will also be uploaded. And to let you know that we are live tweeting on the Twitter of the G Academy EU and the Gearing Grows. So we would really like to know your thoughts and would really like to see your tweets online. This is a brief introduction of the agenda of today's webinar on biases and bias and resistances. So thank you very much for the attention from my side. I'll give the floor to Lucy now.
Thank you, everybody. I understand there were some problems with the sound. Could you tell me if it's okay now that we've changed presenter? Yes, okay, thanks. So thank you to Maria and to Vasya for the introduction. Welcome everybody to this webinar. I am Lucy Ferguson and I'll be moderating the webinar as well as giving a short presentation. The objectives of the webinar today are to understand the role of gender bias in leadership and decision-making, explore resistances to gender equality in leadership and decision-making, and discuss strategies for tackling bias and resistances. We will be keeping everybody muted because we've got a large number of participants. So the way that we'd like to proceed is the interaction will come through the chat facility. So please feel free at any time to type any comments or questions. I'll be collecting those as we go through the webinar, and we will have a discussion after both presenters have spoken. So any questions, anything that comes to you as we go through, please feel free to put that straight into the chat and I'll collect all those together. We will finish by 11:15 at the latest and look forward to some interesting discussions. First of all, I'm going to pass to our first presenter, Maxime Forrest from Yellow Window, and he's going to talk about bias. Thank you, Maxime.
Yeah, thanks giving me the floor, Lucy. I'm Maxime Forrest. I'm a gender trainer at Yellow Window and a gender scholar at Sciences Po Paris, and I'm involved both in Gearing role and gender equality academy project, and so I'm very happy to be with you today for this first discussion. I think there is someone else sharing the screen, and it seems I cannot start sharing mine. Yeah, now I can. Here we go. Okay, so the title of my presentation is pretty long, so I won't read it out loud. But the basic point of my discussion is to challenge the commonplace idea that meritocracy is to be opposed to gender equality, and specifically to positive actions aiming at supporting or achieving gender equality. Sorry, I tried to get rid of something on my screen. Yeah, so are both actually to be opposed? What we noticed when we try to support gender equality strategies or plans to be unfolded in research and academic institutions is that merit-based recruitment and appointment processes are often opposed to the principle of positive action. And in the particular area of research and the academia, this opposition also stems from academic freedom and the pursuit of research excellence and academic excellence. And one of the results of this situation, of these hindrances, is that research performing organizations in general are lagging behind democratic bodies like parliaments, for instance, especially in the case of members of the European Union, but also behind public administration and ultimately even behind large private corporations in ensuring equal access to leadership and decision-making. And nevertheless, one can actually wonder why both should be actually opposed to each other. And my argument in this presentation is precisely that they are not to be opposed. A gender-biased notion of meritocracy, by which individuals with different circumstances, be they due to social hindrances, gender, origin, or other aspects, are expected to take the same path toward leadership position, is actually the problem that we have to tackle. And this we have to do precisely for the sake of real meritocracy and excellence, a notion of meritocracy and excellence that will not be based on the reproduction of privileges or on premiums which are not linked to individual merits. So what's the problem? Because if bodies overseeing research at EU and national level have been worrisome and increasingly concerned with the access of women to decision making, it's because we have actually a problem. First, women are unevenly distributed across research areas, and that's about horizontal segregation. And this means technically that the pool of potential leaders are also very uneven depending on the research area, but also on the particular research area in a specific country. What we see from this graph taken from Schiffiger 2015 is that there is a very uneven representation of women according to areas of research and academic endeavor, from natural science through engineering and technology to humanities. And that this uneven distribution is also uneven according to countries. What does it mean actually? First, it means that there are fields that are sought to be more male or female, or framed as such, but it means also that this distribution is not based on the same story and on the same prejudices in respective countries, depending on the path of institutionalization of each research area, for instance, but also based on cultural factors. And no matter the side of the pool, women are dropping out from a so-called leaky pipeline as we move up the career ladder and make their way to the top in even smaller and smaller number, and that's about vertical segregation. So whether we are in a field with a considerable amount of female graduates, for instance, or PhD candidates, or in a field like system of information or computer engineering, where there is much less female graduates, well, the leaky pipeline will work anyway and leave a smaller and even smaller proportion of women in position to pretend to leadership position. So gender ratios at different stages of the academic career are pretty different. On the left of your screen, we have the so-called scissor diagram that applies to the typical career path in all disciplines. And on the right, you have the situation, which is actually even worse, in the so-called STEMs, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And we see that in the case of all disciplines taken all together, there are actually more women on average in the EU involved in higher education until the level of PhD degree, but this proportion is decreasing sharply along the career path, leaving less women in position to take up leadership position. So unequal career progression is combined with lower access to leadership position, decision making, but also to resources. And that was this evidence in one of the studies that was actually carried out to reveal, to unravel the uneven access of male and female researcher to research grant, which is very strongly connected in our context to achieving leadership position. So based on those problems that have been widely identified and documented, we can challenge the notion that meritocracy is unbiased, and especially unbiased with regard to gender. There are many metaphors that have flourished to typify this situation based on vertical and horizontal segregation, like the sticky floors, the glass walls, and the glass ceiling. And by the way, what is also typical in the illustration that you have on the screen right now is that what it tells of the request made to women applying to leadership position to stick to the norm, and that's here to be seen also in how they dress. The dual effect of horizontal and vertical segregation has been described through metaphors, as I said, and those are pointing out to different conditions or circumstances, definitely not merits for accessing leadership. The sticky floor is a discriminatory employment pattern, keeping workers, and primarily women, in the lower ranks of the job scale, with lower mobility and invisible barriers to career advancement. That's a definition taken from the thesaurus as a glossary putting together by Hege, by the European Institute for Gender Equality. Glass walls refer to women being often boxed into support functions with their own more limited upward mobility pattern. And that's something that we can see very much in research organization. There is often this argument that, yeah, but we do have women in leadership position. Look at our human resource director or our director for communication, for instance. But this type of functions are thought to be support functions, and there is a strong there is a little mobility, horizontal mobility between those paths and those taking you up to other type of leadership position like financial one or scientific director, for instance. And the glass ceiling refers to those artificial impediments and those invisible barriers that actually oppose women's access to top decision-making and managerial position, whether it is public or private and in whatever domain, and this is obviously especially strong in research and the academia. So what we can actually challenge through this perspective, through this gender lens, is that there will be a one-fits-all pattern of merit, as we can see from this cartoon. Academic power structures are very resilient to change. And one of the reasons why they are so resilient to change is that they are dating from an era when women are usually more limited, if at all, access to careers in higher education and research. There is obviously not the same story of institutionalization for all disciplines. Computer science was born during World War II, and physics or medicine were born during, let's say, the Greek antiquity. But there is definitely a pattern of institutionalization in conditions that were heavily male-dominated. And the gender-neutral or allegedly neutral pattern reflects in a number of aspects, including, but not limited to, the expected credentials and achievements to attain leadership position, the patterns of dedication and commitment, notably time-wise, as well as the expected leadership skills from potential leaders, career progression patterns, as we said, when to achieve which stage of your career and actually in which order, with little flexibility as we know, but also the role of informal and yet institutionalized practices in decision making. Not everything by large is codified, and things do not always happen according to the rules, but there is a number of discussions which are lobby discussion, and that also explains the role of peer selection and networking, which are often leading to reproduction. And that's actually one of the main issues we do face when challenging this situation. Gender bias and inequalities are reproduced through leadership and decision-making positions or bodies, which are actually social or social instances where this gender bias are being institutionalized, if not effectively challenged. And there are to that several aggravating factors that contribute to this system of reproduction. The first one is the Matilda effect, coined by the historian of science Margaret Rossiter back in 1993, which is describing the systematic invisibilization of women in science. So when there are women in the room, actually, women that could legitimately aspire to decision-making position, they are more at risk of seeing their own merit, credit, and contribution to research and science being downplayed by their male counterpart, according to the pattern of the Matilda effect. And the second well-documented contributing factor is the role of unconscious bias, and specifically unconscious gender bias, by which our brain is fit to quickly categorize people based on social or other characteristics as pertaining either to our in-group or to an out-group that we believe is not like us and not fit for the purpose. And we know that this is ironically a byproduct of the efficiency of our brain. It is because we are very efficient at categorizing people based on previous experience, on prejudice, which is prejudicare in Latin, which is basically what comes before an informed judgment. Well, the byproduct of this efficiency is actually discrimination. So what equal treatment is truly about once we acknowledge both invisibilization of women, the gendered pattern of institutionalization of scientific disciplines, and the role of gender bias, of unconscious bias in general? Well, it is about inclusion versus reproduction, because treating people the same is not equivalent, definitely, to treating them equally. Actually, if it fails to take into account the different circumstances that affect their opportunity or their ability to conform to the standard norm expected from them, then it is actually discriminatory. And reversely, treating people differently is not equivalent to treating them discriminatorily. Because if it aims precisely at correcting bias and adapting the organizational culture, well, I would say to the reality of life, of social roles of men and women in society, and to their different circumstances, then it allows for people to achieve positions based on their own merits, which is the point of meritocracy, I guess, not privileges or premiums. So if we place ourselves on the path towards inclusive excellence, we should be aware that universities and research organizations are increasingly bound to pursue excellence because we are in a highly constrained and competitive context, and the situation is definitely not getting better in the post-COVID-19 context. And this does not only mean recruiting and retaining best talent, as it is often argued or advertised, but also favoring diversity to better address and anticipate actual needs of society, to facilitate change and disruption, to tackle major global challenges, to exerting the social responsibility ascribed to universities in educating the society and bridging the gap with other public institutions. That's the one that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. So gender-biased, unchallenged concept of meritocracy in every respect seems alien to these goals. So what next? Well, rising awareness on unconscious bias can definitely help controlling them, but this has to be a systematic and deliberate approach. Challenging skills, measurements, and tacit patterns of merit through gender audits or participatory gender audits can definitely help as well. Positive action also help breaking the reproduction of imbalances and inequality, either through enlarging the pool of potential candidates by actively looking for them and not pretending they do not exist, through reviewing nomination processes to ensure gender balance by debuting informal processes, among others, through establishing quantitative targets for greater gender balance, and eventually, which is usually what triggers the most opposition or resistances, by adopting gender quotas, as those that have been adopted, often after a long and heated debate in other merit-based selection processes with some success. And definitely, by actively addressing resistances to change as a very part of the process of change. But this, I will leave the ground to Lucy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Maxime. Really interesting presentation. I am Lucy Ferguson. I work as a trainer for the Gender Equality Academy and also a researcher on gender training and structural change for gender equality. Today, thank you, Maxime, for setting up my presentation. I'll talk about how we address resistances to achieving gender equality in leadership and decision making. As Maxime just said, resistances we understand as a key part of change, particularly transformative change or disruptive change. I just want to start with a quotation by Fiona Mackay. We should celebrate as a success cases where the status quo has to start to work hard to reproduce itself and has to invest resources and energy in resisting gender change. The need for visible resistance to positive change is a success. It is evidence of the chipping away of patriarchy. It might be chipping away really slowly, but it is changing. So I just ask you to reflect for a moment on whether you agree with Fiona Mackay's definition of resistances there and what they mean. Feel free to write a comment in the chat or as we go along if you have a response to that quotation. When we look at these, yeah, thank you, Ines. If you could just write your response in the chat, please, because we're not able to bring in discussion at such a large webinar. So please put your comments in the chat. This quotation often divides a room. I find many do agree with it, and others find it not enough, not good enough. So please feel free to add any comments or reflections as we go on, and we can come back to it in the chat. So in terms of where we are up to on working with resistances, we are working at the moment as Yellow Window and as a collection of different structural change projects to develop a theory and practice of resistances. We are collectively developing examples, bringing those together, collecting more and more examples, bringing these, working harder on the definition of resistances, and also categorization. How do we work better to understand different kinds of resistances? In doing this, we draw on a number of sources, including the Handbook on Resistance to Gender Equality in Academia, developed by the FESTA project, and Emanuela Lombardo and Ludmila Gert's work on resistances to gender training. So we have a foundation there, and we're building on that theoretical foundation by engaging with these ideas in substantive ways in our workshops on resistances to structural change in various Horizon 2020 projects, which we've been conducting over the last few months, and we continue to conduct for different projects. We are also, in the same collective way, working to develop a toolkit for dealing with resistances. So I would say that the literature and theory on resistances is not as well developed as that on bias, as that on meritocracy. We are in an earlier stage of understanding resistances and developing how we address them. So I'm just letting you know that we're doing this in a very kind of participatory way, and we are always looking for ideas on how to expand our work on resistances. And I think by its very nature, it is something that needs to be done in a participatory way. it's particularly a topic that can be addressed well in a face-to-face scenario when you can rehearse particular situations, particular scenarios. And we are currently working to think about how those kinds of very substantive face-to-face kinds of activities and learning experiences can be replicated in some way online. So that's an interesting further challenge on how we're working with resistances at the moment. We do, as I said, we are working on categorising resistances. We're not the only people that have been doing this. This has been going on for a few years now. And this is something that we present to our groups when we're in the training about, like, how do we categorise resistance? How does it make sense to categorise resistances? We have a rough framework of why are the resistances happening, how are the resistances being manifested, and who is resisting, or what is resisting. In terms of why, it's important to understand whether resistance is specifically directed towards gender equality, or whether there are other issues that are in play here which aren't necessarily to do with the political or the normative framework of gender equality, and maybe about a whole host of other things, including things about system within the institution, resistances to change in general. As Maxime's already pointed out, higher education is extremely resistant to change in general. So sometimes it's useful just to be very clear about whether we're facing resistance to change in general, or is there something specific about gender equality that's happening here, that we're in a resistance that we're experiencing. Secondly, how is the resistance being experienced? When I say how the resistance, I think we can talk about resistance to the implementation of gender equality plans, just to be more specific. Sometimes we experience resistances as very active and explicit. This can be through a range of different behaviours, from outright rudeness, outright sexism, to open disagreement with the idea or concept of a gender equality plan. So that's on one side, and then on the other side we have the more passive or implicit resistances. These might be more difficult to identify and sometimes also more difficult to address, because here we're talking about, in a lot of ways, inertia, or for example, a commitment and agreement to do something in a face-to-face scenario, but then lack of action. So we could call that a passive or an implicit resistance. And I imagine everybody familiar with working on the implementation of gender equality plans will recognise these different areas and categorisations. I can see the chats coming in, so I will look at those in a moment. And then in terms of who, we have lots of debate about this category, whether it's useful and whether the boundaries between the different aspects. So we can say, is it an individual? Are we dealing specifically with one person? If we're dealing specifically with one person, then where does that person's specific objection stem from? And also, how important and influential is that person in the process of implementation? Secondly would be a group, perhaps a particular group of colleagues or a particular department of the university, or a particular subgroup that seems to be very strongly working together to frustrate the implementation of gender equality plans. And then, of course, we also have institutional resistances, which we are studying, and we need to study more the ways in which the secret lives of institutions and informal cultural rules, norms, and practices work together to generate resistances to the implementation of gender equality. So this is a very rough sketch of how we're categorizing resistances in our work. And I just thought you could take a moment to think about any examples of resistances to gender equality that you've experienced, specifically in terms of leadership and decision making, perhaps coming back to Maxime's set of measures that can be enacted to address imbalance. What kinds of resistances have you experienced? And while you're reflecting on that, I'm just going to open the chat. I agree. No engagement means nothing is changing. Yes, I do agree, but I've not seen yet this visible resistance in practice. Raises the challenges to a more visible place where dialogue and awareness can evolve. I do agree, but I feel we can move faster, or at least try to. Our capacity to distinguish institutional inertia from institutionalized resistance is also at stake. Okay, Maxime, in the discussion, I'm going to ask you to unpack that a little. Institutional inertia versus institutionalized resistance. Yeah. The quote's focusing on a positive view to resistance, which may not be the experience of a lot of people, but I think there's definitely a merit in this attitude. In general, I agree, but actual resistances can also mean that the already gained success are in jeopardy and we face some kind of backlash. Placing institutions in a situation where they have to actively and explicitly defend the gendered order and power distribution, change agents get more grip over the debate and agency, but it's only the beginning of the path. Okay, we have some issues around men's resistance, resistances in the form of lack of resources for gender equality, supposedly feminine style of leadership as resistances. And then we have some further points and questions here. Invisible resistances, reproducing the model, i.e. nomination in the reduced old boys circle. Another point about the exclusion from the men's club as a major obstacle to being considered for leadership conditions. Reluctance to clarify or make official informal nomination procedures. Thank you. So we're having some interesting examples, and these seem to be very much those living in those kind of secret lives of institutions that we were just talking about. Coming back to some of these are institutional resistances in the sense that they're very strongly embedded in the culture of leadership and decision making of institutions, and resistances to change in general. Okay, we have lots of comments coming through. Sometimes women have leadership positions on paper but are excluded by decisions in an informal way. Another resistance here, that positive affirmation is against meritocracy, the same debates that we dealt with in Maxime's presentation. And there's a question here from Susanna, which I'm going to leave for the discussion afterwards. We want to work as well, of course, beyond just categorizing resistances, to think about how we address those resistances. So if we move on with the presentation, in our workshops, we work on developing a plan per institution for detailing the resistances that are currently being experienced to implementation, and also developing some strategies about how to address those. So stage one, what we suggest is identify the resistance. This seems obvious, but in a lot of ways, we find that in the trainings, in the face-to-face trainings, it's quite empowering to name the resistance and categorize it. And just as some of the comments coming through here about the quotation from Fiona Mackay, demystifying the resistances and breaking them down and categorizing them and mapping them is an empowering exercise in itself, because it can make addressing the resistances seem more manageable and more possible. So identifying and categorizing in itself is quite an empowering exercise in order to lay things more clearly. Then something that we work on very much in the training is reactions to resistances. How do we react as individuals and as a team when we are faced with these kinds of resistances? So the first stage of this is an emotional reaction and a physical reaction, and how we deal with, how we can address those in a kind of individual way, but also as a team, as a core team. And then there's also the more strategic and political ways that we deal with those resistances. But what we're very clear about is that, first of all, we need to acknowledge how these affect us as people and how that affects our behaviour, and that we may be able to be more effective if we're able to reflect a little on the way that we respond when in these kinds of situations, which can sometimes be very difficult, upsetting and stressful, and just important to acknowledge that. But then in terms of being strategic, once we acknowledge our own, we can deal with our own emotional response. How do we act strategically and politically? So something interesting to do is to set some objectives. Okay, so when we go into this meeting, this is the one thing that we need to get out of this meeting. For example, a meeting on discussing different methods for addressing bias in leadership and decision making. So what would be the minimal acceptable outcome as a team we would be happy to deal with? So we're already going in with a political strategy for addressing each resistance. And then stage 2, develop work out which are the best techniques for addressing specific resistances. So this can be done by looking at categorization and also reviewing the kinds of techniques and tools that have worked well for other actors and other projects, sister projects. So for example, 5 concrete action points for addressing this resistance. Moving on from this, then how easy or difficult is this to address versus how important? I think something that we discuss a lot is how sometimes when we're working on structural change projects, we put a lot of energy into very, very visible, very strong resistances, for example, or one particular person or one particular group that tends to suck the energy of the project. And I think it's sometimes helpful to take a step back and say, okay, but how influential, how important is this resistance for the overall project? And also how able are we to really address this resistance? So allowing a more strategic look at the kinds of resistances and how much of our work and energy and time they are taking compared to how influential this person or group or practice is over the implementation process. So that's another tool that can be done to map out how we address different resistances and how we organize them. And so we can prioritize which resistances we want to address in which order. So just to finish, coming back to the quotation and the broader discussion, why do resistances matter? Resistances matter because, as we know, there are persistent blockages to the implementation of gender equality plans, gender equality policies and programs more broadly in higher education, but not just in higher education, in all institutions. And resistances are a useful way for understanding the challenges and opportunities for institutional cultural shift. And engaging with resistances, as we know, is essential for a gender transformative approach, and particularly in terms of sustainable and lasting structural change. So thank you for listening to my presentation. We have lots of interesting comments in the chat, which I'm going to look at now. In order to guide the discussion. I think what I'll do is, first of all, take comments and questions for Maxime. So could you please let me know in the chat if you have any questions or comments to Maxime's presentation on bias. The first point, while people are reflecting, Maxime, the first point was Juliette's point based on your images, where you talked about you know, their dress and fitting in a certain way, and her comment was that all the women in these comment images are white as well. And I think that might be an interesting starting point for this discussion.
Yeah, actually, I don't think it was the purpose of this illustration. In my case, it was to show also that, but I think for those who design it, they miss the point that they actually enlighten the reproduction of the norm, of the dominant norm in a given context. So if you are confronted to a sticky floor, glass walls, and to a glass ceiling, it is also because you are expected to fully fit one size, and this one size in research and the academia is the one, almost one single pattern in generic term, despite the difference of context, despite the number of new paths towards full professorship, for instance, that have been emerging over the past decades. But despite these differences, there is still one single one-fits-all pattern of academic career in terms of timing, in terms of type of responsibility you should exert at which point of this particular career, in the way you should look like, behave like, and what are the expectations. And those expectations are heavily gendered, and they are institutionalized in a way that impedes you to move up the career ladder, unless you pretend to fully stick to the norm, and you make the different sacrifice that go with it, and which have little to do with your actual merit.
Thank you. Juliette, does that address your original point? So I think there's a question about intersectionality here as well, in the sense of there are very much part of the mold is that you're a white woman and you wear the suit as well, you're able-bodied, and there are various aspects here which we are working on, yet probably we've still got more work to go in that sense.
No, definitely. I mean, with regard to intersectionality, I mean, when you address gender bias in research in generic term, which tends to be non-intersectional one, you actually necessarily faced with the impact of intersecting inequalities, and indeed those pictures also reveal that that the situation which affect able-bodied white women from Western countries is definitely not the same as for people who are placed at different intersection between different streams of inequality or discrimination, and but the very rational, the very working of those bias is actually the same, unless that it multiplies.
Yeah, thank you. There's a comment from Adeniyi about it's passed down through generations, and this makes it more difficult to address gender bias in leadership and decision making. So a suggestion that the target of gender equality plans and structural change should be on the younger generation of potential leaders through proper education about gender equality and why it's important for a better society. Do you think that we address that substantively with our current approach to structural change?
It's a question for me?
Well, yeah, the general question, I can answer it as well.
Yeah, I mean, to change, there is a trend. I mean, often there is a discussion about the focus. We should focus our efforts on. Is it on the top? Is it on the top leadership?
Exactly.
Who is often the most reluctant to change, but we can make a quick difference if you get him or her on board. Or is it on middle management, who are the people who actually control the way an institution is working on a daily basis and are often off the picture of structural change? Or is it on the younger generation of future teachers and researchers? Actually, you have necessarily to scatter a little bit your effort between those different target groups, because they all help making a difference, and you can hardly forget any of them, and you can hardly forget students as well, because they can leverage for change by asking for quicker change, by asking for more intersectionality, which is usually a point upon which they increasingly insist, at least in the institution I've been working in. So we cannot really dismiss one or the other target. There will be, it will help to support the younger generation to adopt a different perspective, but it is necessary also to bring the change right now, which involves people in position of decision-making at this very moment.
Okay, thank you. I think that's helpful also in terms of the resistances categorization, in terms of who are our target groups and how do we work differently to address different target groups. I just got a couple more questions for you, please, Maxime, from the chat, and then we'll go on to discuss the resistances. From Lena, is attracting more men into lower positions a mean to tackle the sticky floor, or does it aggravate the problem given the leaky pipeline? And I'll give you a second question, which I don't know if it's for you or for me. Why, from Marek, why are top leaders so often reluctant to change?
Be starting with the second one, which is indeed that you will be able also to address. That's a question that I'm actually wondering myself, having been working in this realm for a while. We are in a context which is supposedly driven by change. We have to face societal, climate, migratory challenges all across the globe, and research institutions and universities are meant to be part of the solution. We are in a context, in an academic context, which has been dramatically changing over the past decades in terms of funding, in terms of recruiting people, in terms of technology, and especially in this COVID-19 situation, of distant learning and digitalization. And we are still facing with people who have difficulty to identify the agenda of change for their own institution. So it's not only about gender, it's about grasping change in general, and then gender coming to the picture. And I think that gender can, the gender perspective and an intersectional perspective can help those people in leadership position to better address change in general terms. If they are not able to address gender bias and other type of bias, how would they possibly in capacity to tackle big societal or climate challenges with a full speed? And I'm not sure I get the other question about attracting more men in lower rank position. I mean, men also go through lower rank position. The question is, the mobility upward is different. They don't get as much stick there. And I think one of the differences between men and women with regard to getting stuck in lower rank position is about horizontal segregation. Is because they can be also lower in the scale, but they are not in the same type of position necessarily. And this gives them more possibility upward. So it is also about this these glass walls we have been dealing with.
Okay, thank you very much, Maxime. We can move on to have some discussion about the resistances now. There's lots of interesting points and questions coming through. I just wanted to ask you, please, Maxime, to clarify your point, which was about institutional inertia versus institutionalized resistance. Could you just unpack that, please, a little bit?
Yes, I think basically typology that you have been mentioning are very important, because we have a difficulty ourselves being change agents, or attempting to be, to identify inertia, to distinguish between inertia of the institution, because there are ways of doing things, because people are better seated than standing up. That applies to ourselves as well, because it's always more burdensome to provide change and to just reproduce what you have been doing, and what is actually embedded institutionalized resistance to change, and specifically to gender. And we have to be better equipped to make this crucial distinction, because what is often presented as inertia, as ways of doing things, is actually a very conscious effort not to change, and a very conscious type of resistance, because this status quo is benefiting categories of people and people in decision-making position in particular, and therefore they are reluctant both to change and to unravel the deliberate nature of their resistances. But this you know more about than me.
Yeah, thank you. I think that is a further useful tweaking of the categorization that we need to take into account. And every discussion, every training is an opportunity to refine these ideas. There were a couple of key themes coming through in the chat, particularly interesting, and also following on from that point, is about vested interests and reluctance to change being really about privilege and power. So that's why I thank you for those comments, everybody that sent those through. That's why I think that we are very focused on as change agents and on training change agents, working and thinking politically, Maxime, as you always say. That we need, this is a political, it's political work, it's strategic work, and we don't necessarily always have the training to do that political and strategic work as academics, as researchers. So it's something that needs acknowledging and needs developing in its own right as skills. But how do we actually address those vested interests and patriarchal structures within institutions? And I think the answer here lies to that we work further with dealing with privilege, and we engage in a much more substantive and political way those top senior managers and decision makers in working on not just giving a discursive commitment, but actually engaging in order to really give up some of that privilege. And what does it mean? And I think that we touched lightly on those ideas about giving up a privilege, but I think that we still got a way to go with that in our work, especially if we're mostly tackling middle management and we leave the senior management out of it, and we don't really engage with those with the aspects of privilege. So I think that's one answer, but also just to continue thinking politically and strategically. We have other ideas, questions about the kind of what we call gender fatigue, in the sense of we've been working on this for so long and change seems to be very slow. And while it's good to agree with Fiona Mackay's reading, yes, we're seeing some resistance, but there is still very, very strong backlash against this, and that's different in different contexts. So how do we keep our motivation and momentum as change agents, and also how do we make this sustainable? And I think it's really important, this question of sustainability beyond the life of structural change projects, and we work hard to keep this sustainability, but it's a difficult challenge. I think one of the issues in terms of motivation of us as groups of change agents and core teams of these projects is that we need to first of all acknowledge the toll that it can take, understand the gender fatigue, and do this kind of important care work as a team to make sure that we don't reach burnout. And that's another way of sustainability. And I think that's the point about the resistances, how we have to be very careful not to put all of our energy into lost causes. So it's a case of measuring very carefully how the energy is spent, and what outcomes and what strategies are most likely to lead to this political change, and particularly in a sustainable way. So that's my answer in terms of how to keep the motivation going and how to continue the push for structural change. We have another 5 minutes for questions. There's a lot of interesting points coming through in the chat. It's going to be very interesting to read the issues to read it in detail. We unfortunately can't go through all the comments now. We're talking about psychological insecurity in some cases, and I think that's a very good point in terms of when we categorize in terms of who's resisting and why. Sometimes there can be personal issues that aren't necessarily completely related to gender equality, and that's very useful to make those distinctions. There's some points about different international contexts. Yeah, Maxime, you wanted to come in with a point? Yes, please do.
I think there are also several questions, several remarks about women in leadership position being often perceived as even more reluctant to deliver change for gender equality. Actually, that's not very surprising. If we are here to challenge the norm that lead to reproduced power position and career patterns and conception about leadership skills and so on, and if we admit that in male-dominated areas and bodies and positions, the women who make their way had to some extent to stick to the norm and to demonstrate or over-demonstrate that they fully fits the male-dominated standard or the androcentric standard. It's no big wonder that they are reluctant to challenge the very standard that they have put so many effort in sticking to. So therefore, the question is not so much about people, about individuals and what they can do, or the contribution they can make themselves because they are women in leadership position, but in further challenging collectively the standard and the norm of meritocracy and merit as such, so that future candidate, whatever their gender, whatever their origin, whatever the differences of their past, will be judged on their merit, and will not have to stick to that androcentric male and white norm.
Yes, thank you. And this is something that comes up a lot in the trainings and the workshops on resistances about, okay, but how do we deal with the women in senior leadership positions that in a sense are pulling up the ladder underneath them and don't really want to engage in gender equality issues. And I think this is another example of where it can be useful to really work out what's going on here with a particular leader or a particular group and try and engage on yes, exactly. So how do we deal with this? So one of the things that we look at in the trainings, for example, is kind of rehearsing scenarios, and I think this can be very useful within the core team just to do a simple role play, just to rehearse how this situation normally goes and how could it go differently if we did things differently. So it's just very simply changing small aspects of behavior. One of the things we talk about, for example, is like the meeting before the meeting. So if you know there's a big meeting where you're hoping for someone's commitment, having a meeting with that person first, talking on a one-to-one basis and trying to get some kind of commitment and understanding. And what we can see, and again it's coming through in the comments, is that those commitments on a one-to-one basis or in an informal conversation often evaporate when that support is really needed. So it's about developing accountability, developing shared accountability. And this doesn't just apply to women leaders who are resistant, but really to all resistant leaders. Like shared accountability that can then be called upon at a later date with very simple techniques such as, thanks, as we discussed in our meeting on Tuesday, and you know, you gave your pledge to this particular policy, so So these are kinds of simple techniques that we are developing that we can use, but I don't think it's really enough just to have a written thing, oh, I'll do that, because it's working politically, it's thinking politically, and it also has emotional baggage connected as well, as we've said. So I think really within core teams, I can't stress enough how useful it is to rehearse the way that you're going to approach this scenario. And have the support as well of the core team when you go in, because working politically is not easy, and addressing resistances is not easy. So the more we acknowledge that it's a challenging endeavour, the more that we can have hope of addressing the resistances. I think we're going to close the conversation now. We have lots of questions about dealing with specific issues with resistances, which we can, and one particular here, how do we deal with the argument that gender equality in leadership positions will come naturally with time? And I think that there are lots of questions here about specific ways of addressing resistances. And I think what we can do is for these specific issues, two things. One is to go back to the presentation here in terms of the steps for addressing them, categorizing, how do we react, what techniques can we use, what objectives would we like, what we'd like to see. And then the second part is working on a strategic framing, which we don't have time to discuss now, but there are other webinars on this point about really packaging particular information and presenting it in a certain way in order to be the most effective. So strategic framing is another of our tools within this broader approach of working politically. So I'm going to close the discussion there. Thank you to everybody for your points. I'm just going to pass now to Maria, who's just going to say some words to close the webinar, and then Vasya will finish. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think it has been a very interesting webinar, which is already new before we started. It has introduced questions that are important to reflect on: why, how, who, in terms of resistances. We have to assume that meritocracy has its own biases, and we have to identify them and to denounce them. It's important to assume that different values that is attributed to masculine and feminine, and the incidence of the sexual division of the work, and also the incidence of sexualization of female bodies and the intersectional perspective. I thank you very much for your assistance and participation, and thank you very much Lucy Ferguson and Maxime Forrest for their interesting presentations. And we see you in the next webinar, I hope.
Thank you. I hope that now you can hear me well, and there's no pitching voice anymore. Thank you very much. Oh, there is a bit. Oh, on the background. Okay, I'll try without those. Is it better now? Okay. So just stay tuned, because more webinars are coming for Gender Equality Academy. There is one organized towards the end of May that will be announced very soon. Thank you very much, Maxime and Lucy, for all the very thought-provoking presentations and the discussion, which I think this interactivity level was very interesting also for the participants. We managed to keep a high level of participation. So thank you very much, and see you on our next webinars. Have a nice day.